Um, Hello, everyone. So I covered the Lutheran, which was the publication of the Lutheran Church in America, and I followed from the year 1976 through the year 1978 their coverage of the publication of the Lutheran Book of Worship. And so to begin, they start right in the beginning of 76 with their first issue, with an article, very first article of the year about hymns. They include in that issue a list of the 510 hymns approved and state that no one's really going to be happy with all the hymns selected, but they move past the hymn issue quickly. The next thing that we see is from September, where the LCA convention report, a follow-up for their August meeting, approves the list of hymns and has a hopeful forecast for the Missouri Synode's continued participation in the publication of books. The major holdup for the LCA switches from hymns to actually the structure and the formulations of the liturgy itself. They delay approving the liturgy in 76 to sort of develop some field test and test some congregations. And there's a whole spiff about what the appropriate body approval for approving liturgy is. They debate over like 14 hours about if the executive council of the LCA is the appropriate body to approve it, or if it should go to whole church in their next convention. And there's actually fears about delaying it for another 2 years at this convention over the liturgy. Well, eventually they follow a proposal to go ahead and let the executive committee retain that power if the field tests go well. So in 77, the Lutheran follows a series of articles that are like exposés on the field test of the liturgy. And the response is overwhelmingly positive. In March of 77, there's a preview of the liturgy by Judith Madison in a congregation in Minneapolis, and they ended up loving it and have feelings of they tried it for 4 weeks and didn't want to go back to the other congregation. And so by May, in the news section of their articles, there's an overwhelming, of May of 77, before the exec council approves it, there's an overwhelming positive response. They have tested it in 97 congregations and 12 geographic clusters, and all of the pastors have had access to the test liturgy, and only 5% disapproved of it. So it goes to vote in September of 77, and only 3 of the 33 executive council oppose its voting, so it passes the liturgy and makes the muster for going ahead with publishing in 78. The only thing about 78, the issue quickly falls to the background, and instead they focus in on Missouri's dropping out in 77. They were very hopeful for Missouri's participation, but in August of 77, they have a news article about the Missouri Synode's 2-year delay at their convention. And then the news articles in 78 follow the LCA's response to this in Missouri Synod, and they don't want them to use the LBW title, and there's an article that says the ALC and the LCA is going to come together to do whatever means necessary to prevent this. But by the end of 78, the issue of the Lutheran Book of Worship really drops away. They focus more on electing a new president. But the issue does rise again in the very last issue of the year. In Advent, their December issue, they have 2 articles really kind of testing their response and showing the changes. One helpful article from the Lutheran Forum from 79, and the Lutheran Forum is an independent co-Lutheran journal that tests everything out. One article looks at the LBW 1 year later in the LCA. And it's been an overwhelmingly positive response in that it's both, there's a lot of variability, a lot of flexibility in the new liturgy, and there's also a lot of participation, and even to the point where churches are coming together to rethink the spaces that they worship in, to move, to take some of the naves out, and to get away some of the altars that are like stuck on the east wall so people can be more participatory. So overall, the LCA response is more focused on a liturgy holdup, and then becomes overwhelmingly positive once that liturgy is tested out, and we see how the liturgy is continuing to form the life of the LCA a year out and more into the future.
So my name's Josh Pontius, and I focused my research on the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and their publication, the Lutheran Witness, with regard to the adoption of the Lutheran Book of Worship and its creation in 1978. For those of us who love the LBW or hate it, we can all blame Missouri for it. It started with their idea to create a joint Lutheran hymnal in 65, created the Inter-Lutheran Commission on Worship, brought together the LCA, ALC, smaller synods, in an attempt to do this pan-Lutheran in America hymnal. Unfortunately, in the process of this, there was the conservative takeover of 74 of the LCMS. Mm-hmm. So the publication of the Lutheran Witness doesn't exactly have a hard cutoff in 74, because in 1976, the church is aware of this upcoming hymnal, and even at this point, some of the tests that have been going around, the Lutheran Witness gets a letter to the editor where one of its members is just so sad that some of his favorite songs aren't in the new hymnal, and how dare they create a new hymnal without his favorite songs and the finest melodies of the Lutheran tradition. Words like this get thrown around a lot. But the witness does make note occasionally of other churches accepting and what they're doing. They note in August of 76 that the LCA voted to adopt it. Later in October of 76, they are putting together reports, they're setting up conferences in the LCMS showing, hey, here's the new hymnal, here's what we think is going to be in it. And at that time, everybody in the LCMS, for the most part, seems to love it. They think it's great. Even to the point in the following April, they publish a catechism of question and response of, here's all the things that are in the new hymnal, here's why we're okay with them, here's what we're expecting, here's what's changing, here's what's staying the same, here's how orthodoxly LCMS this document is. It's very much pointing towards, yep, we're moving towards it, we're doing this, it's going to happen. In 77 May, there's a longer article that talks, it's an op-ed, where the author points out things like there's some doctrinal issues in the Apostles' Creed. Does descended into the dead mean descended into hell, and is one okay? But he largely leaves it up to congregations and not allowing a synod to dictate terms on their hymnal. But just a few months later, there's a letter to the editor that kind of lays out, like, putting an editorial pause here because I need a good place to break it. So there's a letter to the editor in July of 1977 where even a member of a congregation in the LCMS says, you know, it may not have everything in it that I like, but maybe it has everything in there that I need. And for me, that's just a very enlightened perspective that sometimes we don't always see even in our own congregations. But in that same month that that's published, the LCMS ends up voting to reject it at their Dallas convention. This hymnal that they started, they say, no, you know, it's really just not what we need. There's too much compromise in it. And it was all their idea in the first place. So, of course, that makes sense. What they do end up doing in the following year is they create a report saying, here's kind of all the issues that we found with it. This is why we didn't adopt it. They submit it to their next convention, which decides to approve it with the changes that were made by their own independent commission. In May of 1978, there's this long, pages-long description of everything that's wrong with the LBW and what they're going to do to fix it. Right after that, there's a letter from the president of the LCMS, Price, who says, yep, this is what we're doing, we approved it, these are all the changes. And in that process, as we heard, they end up creating a new hymnal, which is just the LBW with their LCMS-approved changes. That's eventually published in 1982. And that's all I have.
It's named differently, though, right?
Yeah, it's named. They created a new hymnal, released in 1982, simply called Lutheran Worship.
So, hi, I'm Dan Tate. I am looking at the American Lutheran Church's reaction to and coverage of the Lutheran Book of Worship in their magazine, The Lutheran Standard. The Lutheran Standard chose to kind of commemorate the Lutheran Book of Worship with a series of articles, or maybe you could call them op-eds, about worship in general. This was a year-long series. It covered largely the ALC's understanding of worship. They said that worship is understood as, they understand worship as being grounded in witness to Christ. They understand worship as being a work of faith. There's an emphasis on the work of diligent prayer, of singing praises to God, things like that, over the idea of reception of Christ in worship. That is not emphasized as much. They emphasize also that, according to the Book of Concord, faith itself is true worship. And so they think that you need to ground worship in faith, and if any proper understanding of worship is understood as an expression of faith and as itself a witness to Christ, who he is and what he has done. This leads to them to have a broader understanding of what is appropriate in worship. So long as worship is an activity that witnesses to Jesus Christ, and so long as it is amenable to a Lutheran understanding of that, the ALC is quite open to a variety of forms of worship, and it is open to a variety of songs that can be used. So you will find a number of articles in the Lutheran Standard encouraging a sort of broader selection in Lutheran worship. You will find articles complaining that there is not enough that there's not enough worship that is amenable to small churches, that there is not enough worship that is amenable to people without musical training. You will find people asking that there be a broader variety of songs included, not only in terms of a wider variety of Lutheran songs, but a wider variety of just Christian songs in general that can be properly used by a Lutheran church. As a result, when the LBW does come out, they tend to praise it pretty highly. They like the fact that it has a sort of broader Western Rite liturgy. They like the fact that it has more liturgical options that are better for smaller churches. They like the fact that it has some more contemporary settings and music. They like the fact that it includes worship songs from a wide variety of denominations and ethnicities. They like the fact that it seems to have a sort of broader ecumenical intention in what it's doing. And because all of this fits with their witness-centered understanding of worship, and because the Lutheran Book of Worship keeps a rootedness in Lutheranism, in baptism, in faith in Jesus Christ, they tend to find the greater diversity in the Lutheran Book of Worship and the greater openness to the wider Christian world to be very much a positive thing.
So that's the end of our presentation. You could see that there's one hymnal that is taking 3 different paths to adoption, 2 that take a very literal hardline kind of approach to it, and one ends up taking it, one ends up not, has to do its own revision, and one church that kind of says, yeah, no, we kind of like that it's not perfect in all of these ways, and we're okay with that. And that just shows the diversity of Lutherans in this country, both then and now. So thank you very much.